As we start looking at the Great Depression, we're going to focus on the causes and impacts. I want you to keep in mind what the 1920s was like, right? We watched Boom to Bust already, talking about the spending of money, kind of living this very lavish lifestyle. Things were going very well for people during the 20s. Unfortunately, though, it does come to a crashing halt with the crash of the stock market. That, of course, is not the only reason for the Great Depression, but it's one of the causes. In order to understand the stock market, one thing you need to be aware of is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That is used, even today, it's still used to really give us the big picture of the health of the stock market, whether things are up or down. You'll see that, every day on the news. The Dow is up so many points, the Dow is down so many points. That really kind of gives you, like I said, the average stock prices of the major industries. Throughout the 1920s, this number, of course, continues to go up. Eventually, though, it peaks late in the 20s. And once it peaks, there's a gradual decline. What that does is it starts to panic people, right? People are not super educated about the stock market at the time, and this was new territory for them. And so they began to get very worried. What they would see, for example, is maybe they bought stock, the example we have on here, from GE at $400, but now all of a sudden when they sell it or cash out, it's selling for only $283. So it happens on Black Thursday. Notice Black Thursday, this is not the day of the crash, this is a few days before. Worried investors began to sell off their stock. This is on October 24th of 1929. As people are selling their stock, it means the stock prices continue to fall. However, stockbrokers were actually able to help stabilize the market just a couple days after Black Thursday. What the stockbrokers did was start to push money back into the stock market to help raise people's security and lessen their worry about it. Also, what happens, of course, when you start buying a lot of stocks, that the value of those stocks or the shares of those stocks are going to continue to go up. So it does stabilize, however, it's only for a couple of days. That brings us to Black Tuesday, October 29th of 1929. Prices start to fall again, and investors at that point no longer have faith in the stock market, and so they really begin to dump their stock, to sell their stock before they take an even bigger hit. As you can see on that day, over 16 million stocks were sold, and over $30 billion was lost in the stock market. To compare that to today, that'd probably be around 430 or $435 billion. As I mentioned earlier, obviously the stock market crash is one of the causes of the Great Depression, but it's not the only one. We also have to look at the 1920s economy in general, which was really actually pretty unstable. We had industry just producing way too much. If you kind of think back to the Gilded Age with industrialization, with the assembly line, okay, now all of a sudden we're just producing too much and there wasn't necessarily demand for it. So products were coming off the assembly line, but didn't necessarily have anyone to purchase these products. So that was one issue. We also have the issue, though, when people did go to purchase things that they were buying on credit. It's the buy now, pay later. This tends to get people in trouble, especially when the stock market does crash. They no longer have money. They've maybe lost all of it. And so they can no longer pay back the creditors, right? So if they purchase maybe new furniture from a furniture store and they purchased it on credit, well, now they can't make those monthly payments to the furniture store. That furniture store then isn't going to be able to keep their business running. So again, we're looking at the 1920s economy just in general and how that really ended up leading into the Great Depression as well. The other issue that we want to talk about for a second is just over speculation. These are people buying stocks, right? Buying shares of stocks that are rather risky, and they're using borrowed money to do that. When you purchase stocks using borrowed money, it's called buying on margin. So now you have people borrowing money to purchase stocks. Then when the price of stocks drops, they no longer are even making money and they don't have any money to pay back the person that they originally borrowed it from. All right. So again, in general, if you look at the 1920s economy, it really did set us up for a massive fall once the stock market did crash. When we look at the overall results of the stock market crash in 1929, really everyone was impacted. Even if you didn't have any money in the stock market whatsoever, you were still impacted. We can see there are a variety of different ways. Banks, maybe had invested in companies. When the stocks fell in those companies could not pay the banks back. And so you have a lot of banks actually completely failing and going out of business. Consumer borrowing as well. You could see if you bought stuff on credit, you could no longer pay it back. So that, of course, is going to impact the companies that had loaned you the money, or those small businesses that had loaned you the money while buying stuff on credit. You can see bank runs up there, bank failures, I already mentioned. Savings also were completely wiped out. And if you think about banks, how important they are, if they don't have money to loan out, it means there's no money to make. So when banks then start to fail, people start losing faith in banks. That's maybe why you've heard stories of grandparents or great grandparents keeping stashes of money around their house, under the mattress, some buried in their backyard, maybe put it in a jar in the freezer potentially, right? Because people really lost their faith in banks during this time. Of course, now we have regulations in place to help protect banks during this time and protect people's money. And some of those changes actually come with the New Deal that FDR proposes. We'll talk about that another day. Just kind of give you an idea too about unemployment with the cuts in production. Obviously, businesses were letting people go. People were unemployed, and by 1933, we had over 13 million people in the United States unemployed. The next couple of slides are really going to focus on the overall impact, right? So we've kind of seen maybe what caused the Great Depression, talked about the stock market crash, we talked about the economy of the 1920s. We saw then some results of the Great Crash, but now let's look at how those impacted people on a daily basis. We're first going to look at just kind of living situations for people. This is probably one of the most iconic photos in all of US history. It's known as the Migrant Mother. This quote is not necessarily from her, but it's just kind of this situation that people were dealing with at the time. Again, if you think back to the Gilded Age and the tenement houses and the poor living conditions of people, that was kind of fixed during that progressive era. But now for many, they go right back to that unstable home life and not really having great shelter or know where their next meal is going to come from. So here's one story. In the early summer of 1933, I was 8 months pregnant, and we had just spent our last $12 on 1 month's rent for an apartment, which lacked the most elementary comforts such as steam heat, bathtubs, sunlight, and running hot water. They were usually infested with mice and bed bugs. Ours was. So again, it's almost like we're taking a step back from where we had come from during the Gilded Age and Progressive era. As we continue to look at the impact, one thing that had been mentioned on the pre-test that we took a few days ago was the creation of these small communities known as Hoovervilles. Hoovervilles, again, small communities of homeless people that gathered together. It was for those who maybe couldn't afford rent somewhere. And really what they did is that they would work together to create shelters. Shelters were made of any kind of scrap material, whether it was metal or maybe scrap wood or scrap cardboard. In the picture here, you can see there are actually 3 shelters next to each other. They start sharing walls with one another as well to try to save materials. These Hoovervilles were named after President Herbert Hoover. People really blamed him. They didn't blame him for the stock market crash. They didn't blame him, for the overspending in the 1920s. But what they did blame him for is that there was no safety net. They felt like there was nothing there to kind of help get us out of the situation. And so as an insult to him, they called these little villages of homeless people Hoovervilles. The other thing that we saw a lot of during this time was just pure desperation for families figuring out how they're going to get their next meal, right? How they're going to be able to continue to have a shelter over their heads. So out of that desperation, we see some things happening. One thing that happens is many kids just quit school. They're forced to leave school to help their family. They would beg on the streets. If you were to walk by a homeless child, you are much more likely maybe to give them food than you would a homeless adult. And so many kids end up panhandling to help support their families. Families are also starving. They would raid garbage cans. They would eat roadkill as well. They would do really anything that they could to get money and some of the stories, or to get food. And some of the stories that you're going to be reading or talk about how they would follow a fruit truck maybe, and if a watermelon fell off of a fruit truck, they would all run and try to grab as much of that watermelon as they possibly could. So again, people try to do whatever they can to be able to eat and to feed their family. We also see an increase in health problems as well. If you think about the living conditions and also some of the unsanitary food now that people are eating, and how that would impact their bodies and their physical health. So you see an increase in health problems. We also see a lot of problems at home with families as well, an increase in domestic violence, maybe people losing their homes. Many men at the time, felt like it was their job to take care of their family, right? When we look at typical traditional gender roles from back during that time. And many men felt like failures. A lot of them actually ended up walking away from their families, unfortunately. If we look at the overall suicide rate, it increases by 30% during the Great Depression, and there's a 300% increase in mental health hospitalizations as well. So again, even if you didn't put a single dollar into the stock market, it didn't matter, right? The Great Depression really impacted everyone.